Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that can be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking lightbulb moments for paradigm shifts. Hello, on this week's episode, I had the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. William Sparks. Will Sparks serves as the Dennis Thompson Chair and Professor of Leadership at the McColl School of Business at Queen's University of Charlotte. He also serves as the Managing Director for William Sparks & Associates, a leader, team, and organization development professional services firm. He is the author of Actualize Leadership, Meeting Your Shadow and Maximizing Your Potential, which debuted as an Amazon #1 bestseller. His TED Talk, The Power of Self-Awareness, was released in 2018. He holds a PhD in organizational psychology from the George Washington University School of Business and Public Management. For more information about Will Sparks or his services, be sure to check out the show notes. Hi, Will. How are you?
Good morning, Keisha. I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm doing amazing. I am so excited to talk with you about actualize leadership and managing your shadow. And I think it's a really relevant quote to kind of open up our talk with today. You're very familiar with Carl Jung, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I love this quote that he said, which is, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. I think that's so relevant to what we're going to talk about today. What comes to mind for you?
Well, the fallacy of fate, essentially, to build off of Jung's comment there, is that when we fail to recognize our own darkness, our shadow, when we avoid it or ignore it or deny it, repress it, we project it onto other people. There are all of these mechanisms we use to avoid facing ourselves. And when we're in that state, we want to chalk up our shortcomings or our disappointments or setbacks to fate. The stars weren't aligned for me, or fate was out to get me. And so Jung was very clear that there's no such thing as fate. It's your shadow that an individual has failed to recognize and to begin to integrate. And that, when we look back on our life and we see reoccurring patterns of less than optimal outcomes, if not outright dysfunction, to the sort of the unaware, maybe immature individual, they want to say, well, fate was against me, the stars weren't aligned. But to a more self-aware individual who's willing to take ownership, they can do some deep reflection and say, no, that was actually me causing that pattern of dysfunction. I colluded sort of with myself and my shadow. And so I think there's tremendous insight in that quote from Jung related to how we sort of trip ourselves up. I always tell people, when we shoot ourselves in the foot, our shadow usually pulled the trigger. And that is, but we want to be a victim. So we want to say that it was the fate of the stars, but in fact, it was ourselves.
It sounds similar to the concept of locus of control, like that internal and external locus of control around your mindset. But all of this shadow concept work really plays heavily into your framework for leadership. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my research has been focused on understanding what drives our behavior and sort of the light side of that and the dark side of that, and steps that we can take to stay in the light more often than the dark, if you will. And I call that an actualized leader, which is realizing or actualizing an individual's highest potential and sort of living and leading on purpose. And there are three motive needs that the late Harvard psychologist David McClelland identified: achievement, which are strong, driven for success and recognition, very well-disciplined individuals. Then there's the need for affiliation, which are, in my model, those are the affirmer styles, and that's relationship-driven, warm, friendly, empathetic, encouraging, supportive. And then the third is the need for power or the need for control, and I call that style the assertor style, and that's confident and candid, courageous. And so with those three styles and all of those positive things that go with them, there are three unique leadership shadows, and I think that's my contribution, is understanding that there are unique limitations with those. And so for the achiever, it's a fear of failure, and the management trap is that the individual becomes a micromanager under stress. And the irony is they increase the likelihood that they're either going to fail or artificially limit the trajectory of their success by their own doing, by their need to micromanage every detail. So the fear of failure is the first leadership shadow. The second leadership shadow is a fear of rejection. And the fear of rejection is related to the affirmer style, and that's the relationship driven, warm, and friendly. But their management trap, if you will, or their Achilles heel under stress is conflict avoidance. And so when they need to have a candid conversation or a crucial conversation, when they need to give candid feedback or they need to enforce boundaries, both personal and professional, they tend to be overly accommodating, avoid conflict, or sugarcoat the truth. And in doing so, again, the irony is that they increase the likelihood that they're going to experience what they're trying to avoid, which in this case is rejection or separation. And then the third leadership shadow is a fear of betrayal. And the fear of betrayal is the shadow of the asserter style. So under stress, these individuals become controlling, arrogant, condescending, and very often the people around them, whether it's a personal or professional setting, will often eject as soon as they can. They may leave and go to another company or another division or department within a company or another relationship. And to the asserter, it feels like a betrayal, but in fact, it's their own sort of undoing. It's their shadow that's created that. Their management trap is creating dependency in others, and so they're the very serious consequences. These are you can identify it, you can recognize those patterns, and for folks that are willing to be open enough and vulnerable enough to that sort of self-awareness, it can quite literally transform a person's life. But they have to be willing to sit in that very uncomfortable area of vulnerability and ownership for how they've, at least in part, contributed to these sort of classic and very predictable patterns of dysfunction that we often see.
Yeah. The fear of all of these shadows that you're discussing and you're talking about with all of the different leadership styles, it seems controversial in the workplace to discuss, our weaknesses, opportunities for development in terms of like what's trending in the research and what people are putting out there. You talk a little bit about that in your book when you talk about, it's not a strengths finder culture. Can you share a little bit
Yeah,
more about that?
yeah. So that's a great. I really appreciate you asking that because I was actually talking about this yesterday on a client engagement. We live now in a strength finders culture, so I think that it's you can't even use the word. If I use the word weakness in a MBA class, I'm probably going to get dinged by a couple of students who don't like that word because it has a negative connotation. But in fact, it's supposed to have a negative connotation because if we're going to talk about strengths, we have to understand the counterpart to that. And so my second chapter in my book, Actualize Leadership, is really sort of taking on this strength finders mentality because playing to your strengths and knowing your strengths, that's half of the self-awareness equation, and it's important. But it's also knowing where you go under stress, and that is a real limitation. That can be a career limiting or a career derailer. And it's helping a person understand that. I think we actually do individuals a disservice if we sugarcoat the truth and we only focus on strengths and we don't hold up that mirror to say, here's the other side of that. And so I think culturally, it may not be in favor now, but it reminds me of, as you know, Keisha, I'm a big fan of the band Rush. And one of my favorite lyrics from their song, one of their songs, is that you can twist perception, reality won't budge. And so what may be popular, what may be trending sometimes is a twist of perception, but reality's standing there staring us straight back in the face. And so no matter how hard we try to move away from that and try to use different words or different language, at the end of the day, we're talking about things that we do to ourselves that are negative. And if you want to call them a weakness or limitation or an opportunity for development, however you want to frame it, we've got to come to grips with that so that we can avoid it. That's the whole point of this. If we are delusional and we deny that, and we just want to talk about strengths, I've seen it in my almost 30 years now of teaching and consulting. The pattern, just as Carl Jung said, it repeats over and over and over until a person has the sort of the courage and the awareness to sort of take a hard look at himself or herself.
Yeah, and growth should not be comfortable, right? It should cause discomfort, because if you don't have that discomfort, you won't move, right? There's no reason to pivot. There's no motivation to change, in my opinion.
Yeah, the famous American philosopher Eric Hoffer said, in order, to create that sort of transformation, to dispose the soul to action, you have to upset its equilibrium. So to dispose the soul to action, I think of dispose the soul to transformation, you have to upset its equilibrium. So if you want to stay in the shallow end of the self-awareness pool and have incremental improvement where you're modifying your behavior or you're making, small steps, and that's fine. But if you want to be in the deeper end of true transformative growth, you can't say enough positive affirmations to get you there, to truly transform and have that profound experience, that it will require upsetting your equilibrium. And I think that is that sort of deeper end of the self-awareness pool. And that's sort of where I play, if you will. That's my area of research and consulting, is focused on transformation, as opposed to sort of incremental improvement.
So what's the goal here then? When we're doing this leadership work, this shadow work, what is the goal for me as a leader in an organization, or a manager of an organization? What am I trying to accomplish?
I think at the most basic level, it's the realization that most things that you haven't accomplished or I haven't accomplished are a result of our shadow. It is reclaiming our personal freedom, but with that comes total responsibility. And so, that's the double-edged sword, because if I'm going to be totally free and then take total ownership, then I'm responsible for the good and the bad, for the wins and the losses. And so I think that ultimately we do this work so that we can, really step into our brightest light, our brightest future, our highest potential, and be as successful and as happy and as authentic as we are. My personal belief is that we are meant to be, but it requires that sort of deep reflection and the hard work that it entails sometimes. It's my personal view that it is worth every second. It's worth every tear. It's worth every grueling sort of night of where you can't sleep and you all those sort of things. I've been there, and it's tough. But on the other side of it, is a sense of connection. It's a sense of a greater peace, of not being driven out of fear or ego. It's much more settled. And again, in my personal view, it is worth it. But I think a lot of people avoid that because of the short-term pain that is often a part of that growth process.
And there's this concept, so you have a tool, an assessment tool that you can use to determine which leadership style is your primary style, and then the corresponding shadow. But you also have a modulating variable, right? It's self-awareness, and it determines, the assessment report tells you what level of self-awareness you're at, and what does that mean? Like, if I'm higher in self-awareness, what does that mean for me if, like, my style is an asserter?
Yeah, so
which it is, by the way.
yes,
I'll just put it out there. You know
I do know
that.
that. Me too. So we're kindred spirits there. So the self-awareness is sort of part of that self-actualization score that you receive in the full assessment. And the self-actualization is essentially another way of thinking about resiliency. It estimates the degree of how reactive a person is versus resilient. And so the higher your self-actualization, the more resilient you are and less reactive. So in other words, the higher that self-actualization, less likely the individual is going to engage in shadow behaviors. It takes a lot more to get triggered, and they tend to be less intense. But the inverse of that is true as well. So if I'm low in self-actualization and I'm lower in self-awareness, then I'm sort of walking through life, and there can be body parts in my wake that I'm blindly oblivious to. But it's because that low self-actualization can make a person highly reactive, as opposed to resilient. So they're going through life in this hyper sort of reactivity mode. And that often gets us, into trouble because we do and say things that we later regret, or our ego gets in the way, and so we make decisions based on, a perceived threat instead of a rational, a sort of analysis of whatever the stimulus might be. And so that's the connection piece. The self-actualization is a barometer essentially of resiliency, and it moderates when a person's leadership shadow is activated. Now, the self-awareness piece of this is crucial because self-awareness is a necessary but insufficient condition for self-actualization. In other words, you can't be highly self-actualized unless you have a high degree of self-awareness. But self-awareness alone, you can be highly aware and not care. I mean, people can have a very high degree of self-awareness and not do a damn thing with it. And so I can be highly self-aware and just not care or tell people that's the way God made me or love it or leave it, that's who I am. And so those individuals, they've got the first step there, but they haven't gotten to a point yet to where they're motivated to say, I can't get there from here. And there may be a happy relationship. There may be, a successful business. There may be a thriving career or an effective parent or whatever that is. And not getting there usually means I've got to do some self-work and some self-reflection, and I've got to take that awareness and translate that into a truly change in the way I'm showing up and the way I'm thinking about myself and others and the way I interact with others. So the self-awareness piece is critical to self-actualization. It's absolutely necessary, but by itself, I know some people that are very high in self-awareness and aren't at a place yet where they're willing to do anything about it. So it's a
What
interesting
what what turns that switch on for someone to be able to move from not doing anything about it because I don't care to then
Yep.
wanting to? What's that switch, that light?
That switch is hitting rock bottom. That switch is when the person
Oh, wow.
comes home and half of the closet's cleaned out, or when the person is demoted from work or released from their position, maybe terminated or passed over for another promotion or another failed relationship, on the scrap heap. I mean, it usually, now let me qualify that. Usually and sadly, it takes a person hitting rock bottom before they're willing to say, okay, maybe it's me. The reason that as you know, I published my TED Talk, The Power of Self-Awareness in 2018. And the reason that I did that was to tell my story, which is very personal and, does not put me in a good light at all. And I was trying to tell that story to say, hey, if this can help one person avoid hitting rock bottom, avoid coming home and seeing the closet cleaned out or whatever, then maybe it'll help motivate a person to make this change before you have really no other choice, which was my personal situation. So sadly, though, it's been my experience that while some people can see the distant early warning light of, hey, I really need to make a change, I think often human nature, you don't believe it, especially if you're an asserter. You're not going to believe it until that day comes when you've got nowhere else to go. So that's sort of the impetus for people that leads to this sort of willingness or motivation to do this deeper shadow work.
So it sounds like there's two choices. You can either let life take its course and be forced into hitting rock bottom, or you can be aware of the need for growth and make that choice to choose discomfort over comfort.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, people can, and I think sometimes you get close to rock bottom. Sometimes you see like, hey, this is, we've got an issue here. I know people that have had some pretty significant health scares. They've gotten some really serious diagnoses. They've had, so sometimes it's a health issue. It can be the loss of a parent where a person really steps back and reflects, after that occurs. It can be, the ending of a relationship. There are a lot of different things that can cause a person to sort of say, I need to step back and really think about how I'm showing up and how I may be contributing to whatever pattern of negative outcomes may be occurring in an individual's life. So, there's that aspect. And then there is the other aspect of individuals that sort of just are going to go through life blindly, sort of unaware and always the victim. And that's the part of that. There's a person who has low
Mm-hmm.
awareness. You can listen to them. It's always the other person. It's always the other
Yeah.
person's fault. It's always the company's fault. It's always, and sometimes it is the other person's fault. And sometimes people do work for, bad organizations or whatever. I mean, sometimes that's true. But when you hear it over and over again, sometimes you just got to say, maybe you're the one common denominator in this.
Yeah,
So
it's a pattern.
maybe there's a pattern here for you to, and I think there are some people that would rather be the victim and not take that ownership. And in fact, there's a famous psychoanalyst, Eric Fromm, who wrote a book called Escape from Freedom. And the central thesis of that book is that tragically, a lot of people would rather, be a victim and forego that sort of responsibility and freedom, and they spend their
Mm-hmm.
entire lives trying to escape that, than to own that, take that responsibility, but with that, comes the ownership, the freedom, and then ultimately the accountability for the life that we live.
Yeah. And we're talking about the actualized leader profile in the framework or context of the workplace, but it extends beyond that, right? So if I'm an asserter at work, I'm an asserter in my personal life as well, right?
Yeah,
Is that how it
yeah,
works?
that's
Okay.
that's exactly how. And I can tell you that having done this work for a lot of years, I very often get feedback that people get just as much, if not more, out of it in their personal lives as they do in their
Mm-hmm.
professional lives. But yes, so let's take an asserter for example. They're at their best. They're charming. They're can be charismatic, confident, decisive. Bold risk takers that propel the organization to newer heights, and that's very positive stuff. They're decisive. They're objective. They're candid. And people naturally follow asserters. Now the downside of that is that under stress, if our fear of betrayal shadow is activated, we can be arrogant, condescending, aloof, sort of just this controlling. We can embarrass people in front of the team, and so it creates fear and anxiety in others. And so that is a dependent culture in an organizational setting. But then when we go home, we're in control, we're in charge, we're condescending. Why did you do this? Do I have to make all the decisions? And so that pattern often repeats itself in our personal lives as well. And so the CEO of a company that pounds their fist down and says, people have got to start thinking for themselves. I need creative ideas. I need people to be innovative. If it's a dependent culture, and it probably is, the only way to really remedy that is for the leader to start off by saying, I have helped, at least in part, create this environment, this culture where people are not, they're afraid to take a risk, they're afraid to push back, they're afraid to challenge me. I'm going to make a personal change. I'm going to rein that in so that you all can step into your highest potential. The same sort of dynamic would need to occur in a personal relationship as well. And it takes time. It's not a one and done kind of thing by any stretch. But yes, you see the patterns, that occur at work very often are, they repeat themselves in our personal lives as well.
Yeah, and I'm gonna in the show notes after when we publish this episode, I'm gonna put in the link. You have a link to take and assess the ALP for free.
Yes.
It's a shorter assessment version, but it does give you your primary leadership style. I always encourage those who take it to ask feedback from their spouses, from their friends and their colleagues as well, because those are the individuals like in your personal life that see you day in and out, and they can give you like the most honest brunt feedback that
Yeah.
you deserve to hear.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if it's feedback is a gift, I think the timing of when it's delivered is correlated with how well it's received. So I do think we have to choose the right time, to provide that kind of feedback. But very often, those that know us well would be really candid. I'm actually working with a client right now, and we were doing his actualized leader profile, the ALP, and we did the 360, the ALP 360. His 360 feedback rated him as more of an affirmer, which is the friendly, warm, encouraging. But his ALP self assessment was an intense asserter, and he had told me some things that he had said to his wife and kids, and I thought, man, that's an asserter, just and so he had this disconnect between, well, I think I'm an affirmer and the people I work with think that I am. And so he took the ALP home and showed the blue page of the asserter with the strengths and the shadow, and he said it was unanimous. I think he has three teenage sons and wife were like 100% you're the asserter kind of thing. So sometimes we fake it a little bit at work, but the ALP is designed to measure what is at our core, what's really driving us. And for the asserter, it's control. And so that was a lot of times an asserter will sort of mask that with being very friendly and very very supportive and all of that, but they're doing that to manipulate. And I don't mean that necessarily in a
Yes.
negative way, but they're controlling the outcome, but they're doing it with they're sort of killing you with kindness instead of with Thor's hammer
Mm.
for the
So it's still control at the end of the day. It's just a different
yep,
vehicle.
absolutely. Yep.
Hey everyone, I want to take just a quick break from this week's chat to tell you about something very exciting. It's something for those of you who listen to my podcast that train Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and it's called BJJ Summer Week. So, what is it? Imagine participating in one of the biggest BJJ community camps in the world and training amongst hundreds of other BJJ practitioners. People coming from all around the world with the willingness to share their culture and their knowledge of BJJ with each other. That's what BJJ Summer Week is all about. It's 5 days of seminars, parties, excursions, incredible food, and more in the capital of the Mediterranean, Cagliari, Sardinia. And the next BJJ Summer Week is happening next year from September 20th to the 24th of 2023. If this is something you'd be interested in joining, there is an early bird special if you book now on www.bjjsummerweek.com. If you book by December 31st with the code Paradigm Shifts, you'll get a tatami gi for free. You have the right to cancel the camp before 30th of May for any reason. I'll be there. I'm so excited to go next year. I was there last year. So what are you waiting for? Get your BJJ friends together and start the planning. Book today. Join BJJ Summer Week. Now, let's get back to this week's chat. We're talking about asserters a lot. I know both of you, me and you are asserters. But in terms of like how you describe it, they seem to be the most natural leaders in an organization. But it doesn't mean that an affirmer or an achiever cannot be a great leader in an organization. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know CEOs, the retired CEO of Inpro Industries, Steve McAdam, who wrote the special introduction for the book. He's an actualized affirmer, and this is someone that, Harvard MBA, has ran several companies, serves on 2 or 3 Fortune 500 corporate boards, very, very successful, in his career, and, a strong affirmer. And then you see strong achievers, detailed oriented, very organized individuals that have that sort of precision. And clearly you see those famous achievers that have been profiled by Harvard Business School are Oprah Winfrey and Bill Gates and Tom Cruise and Lady Gaga. And, you see these, high perform. In fact, I just saw something this morning where Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs from Apple, his wife just came out with a story that said it took them 8 years to agree on a couch because he was so detailed oriented that he was just so down to the final detail about what couch he was going to choose. And so you see all three styles in business for sure. But I would say if I just sort of had to estimate, I would say that roughly 65% of the C-suite leaders that I've worked with over the last 30 years, roughly 65% have been asserters. And that's the CFO, the COO, the CEO kind of individuals, that have that sort of decisive, bold action, willing to take a risk, very candid, and kind of thing. And so the challenge is then how do I manage that negative side that can come out under stress?
I can't even imagine what an entire C-suite team of all asserters would be like working with or managing them.
Well, I don't even attempt to manage them. There are many that I work with or facilitate. And it's interesting at the beginning of the discussion, people get me talking over each other. The asserters tend to be skeptical. So when they open up their report and they see the asserter style, they may want to ask me about, well, what's the reliability and validity? Can you tell me the scientific, the science behind this assessment, which is one of the skeptical sort of traits of the asserter. But once they sort of go, okay, it's scientific, it's valid, it's reliable, and especially if they maybe show their spouse or a partner or a coworker, as that settles in, typically the group becomes a little more quiet and reflective, and begin to think about how this may be showing up, at work. and at home. But an actualized asserter is just unbelievable. I mean, they have all of those positive attributes, but then they marry of them or they couple them with being humble. They have marked humility. They take themselves less seriously. They tend to be a little less formal. They don't sit at the head of the table. They sit off to the side. They don't start meetings by declaring what they think and asking if everyone agrees. They start meetings by asking people what they think and to participate first. They're willing to change their mind. They're willing to say, I'm sorry. They're willing to ask for help. So there are these incredible when you self-actualized as an asserter and you get your ego out of the way, it's almost unstoppable because you've got the drive, you're decisive, you're candid, you're bold, you've got all of these positive things. And when you marry that with humility and asking for help or saying I'm sorry and not taking yourself so seriously and admitting when you made a mistake, really listening to other people, not intimidating other people, not creating codependency in others. As I said, it's almost unstoppable.
Amazing. And I just think a lot about this stress and how you react to stress really points you to those shadow characteristics. So if you're unsure at all about how your shadow is showing up, whether it's in the workplace or in your personal life, you can really just think to yourself and reflect on, okay, when was the last time I was stressed? How did I react? Was it, a fight, flight, or freeze response? Did I shout? Did I yell at someone? Like, what was my reaction to that stress response?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can kind of work your way into one of the styles. Is that a good way or a good approach?
You can. I mean, you can. Yeah, you definitely can do that. But it's we are sort of we can be a little delusional when we start reflecting on how we really are and how people really experience. So I think that the having the ALP free, taking that it's very short and it's a great way to give you a snapshot of your dominant motive need and the light and the dark that goes with that. So I think you can do it either way. That's a 30-second activity, and then you get it right on your screen or your tablet or laptop or whatever, and it sort of lays it out. And I saw this experience working with a client yesterday when a very intense asserter opened up his report and went, man, he said, I feel like I'm he came up to me at the break and he said, I feel like I'm getting a reading, like a tarot card reading. He goes, he said, it's eerily accurate and it is coming at a very good time based on some conversations he had been having. And I don't know if they were at work or at home or both, but it's interesting to watch that because a lot of times when I do this work, I'll ask people to self-declare what they think they are when they hear the descriptions. And most people raise their hand to be an achiever. And it turns out that it's achievers are about 25 to 30%, and then affirmers and asserters are about equal at around 35% or 38% each. And so achievers are actually, at least in my analysis, are the lowest, and yet most people self-declare as an achiever first. So sometimes it's nice to have that assessment piece there, so you can go, okay, well maybe, and like it's often interesting to see someone get an affirmer score, and they somehow feel like in a professional setting they're like, wait a minute, I want to win, I want to succeed, I'm ambitious, I'm driven. It's like that's all true, but it's the relationship piece that is, and you can be as Steve McAdam and many others, you can be a very successful business leader as an affirmer, but sometimes there's a little bit of stigma with that because they sort of feel like, well, maybe I'm too soft kind of thing. So, but yeah, so you can reflect on the last time you were activated and what happened and what you said or what you did. And you might want to couple that with the assessment to see if those align.
And it goes back to what your primary motive need is. Not that we don't have those other needs. It's what your primary motive need is. What's moving you? What's going to get you to move? It's been so long since I first had taken the assessment. I think I self-declared as an achiever. To your point, I think I did. I was one of those. And then I got my results back and I was very skeptical as well. Just because I immediately saw the shadow characteristics and was like, nope, not me, right? Yep. Yeah, so it was a really cool experiment to do. I love like just self-declaring before you get the results. Again, I'm going to put the link in for that assessment in the show notes. But okay, so I get my results back. I find out what my style is. What do I do now? Like, what's the next step?
Yeah, so I think that, the next step is to begin thinking about, okay, so what are the inherent strengths that I have that are very natural? I want to continue to play to those. And then where's an opportunity for growth and development? So I think a person has to be motivated to continue to grow and continue to develop both professionally and personally. So I think that, that's sort of the first step in that process. And then someone that's wanting to maybe take a deeper dive, they can begin to reflect on the shadow element of how this, is my fear of rejection causing me to be rejected? Or is my fear of failure causing me to artificially limit my performance? And so, you begin to ask yourself some of those questions, and that can often propel a person to start that process of trying to integrate the shadow. And it's not an easy, it's, Carl Jung said the best that any of us can hope for is a lifelong negotiation with the other being the shadow. So the best that any of us can hope for is a lifelong negotiation. And so that means we have good days and we have bad days, and we have to give ourselves some grace when we, don't do our best, and learn from our mistakes and recommit ourselves or rededicate ourselves, to trying to grow and develop and be better. So I think, we have to have that long-term view that this is a process. It's not a one and done piece, component of that. So I think that's a critical element of having that sort of mindset of, this is a long-term plan for my growth and my development. But ultimately, while this is sort of a analytical psychology approach or psychodynamic, which accounts for the shadow or the unconscious, there's also the behavioral approach, which just says, sometimes the pain of not changing, when that becomes greater than the pain of changing, then all of a sudden I'm motivated. And that's, in other words, that's hitting rock bottom. So
That's
when the
rock
pain
bottom.
shifts, when the pain of not changing becomes greater than, when I have no other option, when I'm at my wit's end, when I look back and go, man, maybe it's me, that's when a person is often really motivated to start that process. And it starts with awareness, but then it's not enough to just be aware of it. You have to take steps to really integrate it in that. And it's Jung wasn't crystal clear about how do we do that. What's the difference between integrating the shadow and indulging the shadow? And so there's a fine line between that as well. And it is a trial and error. And quite frankly, I think it's very unique for everyone. I think everyone has sort of an individual or unique process for doing that. In fact, Carl Jung called self-actualization individuation. It's when you individuate from the masses, and you sort of find your true authentic self, and you walk your path, which is unique to you. So I think there's a uniqueness there, although there are some general parameters around awareness and acceptance that we all have to go through. But ultimately, integrating it, we have to find that fine line between how do we acknowledge it, but maybe not indulge it.
And integrating the shadow, to your point, provides the creativity, insights, abundance. There's a lot of benefits that come out of the shadow.
Yeah, there are. You don't want to eradicate it. You couldn't even if you wanted to. So but you don't want to. Jung was very clear that creative insights, persistence, resiliency, they're things that come out of the shadow. If you've got a problem and you just can't solve it, and very often you go to sleep and you have a dream where the solution becomes very apparent, or you wake up and boom, you've got your answer. That's the shadow, churning on that problem. And if 95% of our awareness is in the subconscious, then it's like, we're using 5% or 10% of our consciousness, but tap into that, sort of mega computer that's going to really do that processing for us and help us, come up with those creative solutions or creative insights. So it's not something that we want to eradicate. And Jung, one of my favorite quotes is, he said, it's better to be whole than perfect. And so, people were saying, well, if I can just eliminate the shadow, then I'll just always live in the light. And he essentially said, well, that's, first of all, it's not possible, nor is it desirable. So better to be whole, better to acknowledge and integrate this Mr. or Mrs. Hyde to our Dr. Jekyll persona. Better to own that and integrate it than to spend our entire lives trying to ignore it or deny it. And that's when we actually feed it and give it more power over us. So it is an existential choice that we all make, even sometimes without knowing it. Choosing not to decide is a choice, and so I think that people may defer it or just ignore it, but ultimately it's there and it's going to come back if we don't put the energy into acknowledging it and into taking those steps to integrate it. In my book, the entire fourth section of the book, the final section, is really designed about the transformational journey, and it provides thoughts around what are the anecdotes for the shadows. The anecdote for the fear of failure is abundance. The anecdote for fear of rejection is connection to your purpose. And the anecdote for fear of betrayal is assurance. And so I talk through those different anecdotes and the process for trying to go through that journey to sort of realize our highest potential and really integrate that darker side.
Meet your shadow so you can manage your shadow so it doesn't manage
Yeah.
you. And this work is never done. And as you mentioned in your book, which I have here, of course, I'm a little impartial because my name is in the acknowledgments. So I have to say I have a signed copy though. It stays on my bookshelf. It doesn't go anywhere. But in this book, as you mentioned, you have antidotes, but you also have some developmental resources in the back in the appendices where you're able to just go through different resources that could help you improve different areas of the shadow and also the attributes, which we didn't get into, but maybe I can get you back for a part 2 and we can go in a little bit more
I'd love to.
on
Yeah.
those. But yeah, this is your work. It extends past the actualized leader profile. We also have the team culture profile, and you also have the ALP 360, and all of those kind of work in conjunction to help organizations better leverage this framework to be better actualized leaders within the organization. Is that right?
That is right. I'm hope to finish the next book, Actualize Teamwork, at the end of this year. So I'm hoping for a 2023 publication, depending on when it gets in the sort of that pipeline process and how long the editing process takes. And then, as you know, be shifting the attention toward actualized coaching and shadow dialogue and the work that you and I have been discussing and exploring for the last year or so. Really thinking about how can we have coaching conversations that allow an individual to let their guard down a little bit and acknowledge that sort of other side and what happened when they lost their temper, what happened when the shadow was activated. So I think there's a lot of work. I'm proud of the work I've done and the research I've done, but I think there's a lot more to do. And so that's what gets me up and going every day. And I'm looking forward to how this affects teams and then coaching and then maybe looking at organizational systems and even maybe larger systems. So there's a lot of work yet to be done.
And it's important work, so thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
One last question before we wrap up, and I like to end all of the episodes with this question. What is the most recent paradigm shift that you've experienced, whether it's related to this work or anything outside of that? Put you on the spot a little.
Yeah, that is sort of putting me on the spot. Let me think about that for a moment. The most recent paradigm shift. Well, for me, as a organizational psychologist, I'm always processing the processing piece. So I think that it would probably be, reclaiming a shadow trait. It would be something where maybe I realized I was projecting one of my shadow qualities onto another individual, and that when I came to that realization that the trait of that individual that irritated me so much, Carl Jung said loosely, this is a loose quote, that which irritates us about others can inform us about ourselves, something to that effect.
Mm.
And I knew that quote, or used to know it, and I could, cite it, but I really hadn't thought about it until I realized that I was projecting my need for control onto a person that I thought was controlling and that really irritated me. And I realized, wait a minute, that's my tendency, when I'm at my worst. And so again, it's that process of reclaiming that and going, okay, let me be mindful of that. And the reason that's so powerful is because when we reclaim that shadow trait, we no longer have that irrational emotional reaction to a person. So when we have an emotional reaction to an individual and we can't quite explain it, we say, well, I really don't like that person, or I really don't like this whatever situation.
Yeah.
very often that's something about ourselves that we're not willing to acknowledge. And so for me, it was a person that was controlling, and I realized, well, yeah, that's my stuff too. And when I was able to reclaim that and integrated it, I don't have that strong of an emotional reaction anymore, because I can sort of smile to myself and go, yeah, that's me, or that was me, maybe.
Yeah. So we can see versions of ourselves in the people that we interact with, right? And they kind of mirror back to us what we need to know. I love that. That's really interesting.
That's
Thank you for
projection. You know,
sharing.
the
Yeah.
reflections that we maybe don't want to acknowledge, that we, if there's something in another person and we really, have a strong emotional reaction, very often it's a reflection of our shadow that we have failed to acknowledge. And when we acknowledge it and accept it, that emotional reaction goes away. And that's one of the, as you said, that's why we do this work.
Well, now I'm going to be going through the rest of my day just thinking, okay, if something irritates me, if someone irritates me, I'm going to be wondering, what part of that is my stuff that I need to work on. So thank you.
Just remember, you got to work hard and play hard too. At some point, I always, when I turn it off, I'm like C3PO in Star Wars when he powers down and the eyes go off. Do this hard work and engage in it. But I think, to me, what has helped is keeping a sense of humor about it and about myself. And, as asserters, never taking ourselves too seriously. If we can get on the other side of that and be able to laugh and relax as well, I think that's a nice balance.
Nice recharge.
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Will. I appreciate your time and looking forward to having a continued chat in the future.
Thank you, KJ. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I am so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.